Hey David, how's it going?
Hey Paige, I am doing well. To bring in the viewing and listening audience, this is a recording of Understand You. I am David, I'm speaking to Paige, and Understand You is a series of conversations intended to promote self understanding through astrology and mindful practice. And today we have some interesting conversation planned. We're going to talk about the nature of events forming and how they are reflected astrologically. And then we have a chart that we're going to analyze together. And Paige, before we go into astrologizing, do you have any general topics that you would like to introduce or share with the listening audience?
Not so much beyond what we're going to talk about. Um, I wanted to discuss events because oftentimes when you go for an astrological reading, that's usually what the client is looking for is the big change, the big event. Is my career going to take off? When am I going to get married? Like people ask these kinds of questions. And so I wanted to talk about events because I have been going through just this massive overhaul in my life. Pluto finally left 5 points in my chart, and now Saturn is trailing it. And it's just interesting to see what that's created, what that has revealed. And I've had a really interesting lesson in the nature of events on the material plane. So like when something physically comes into your world, why? And versus like just an internal shift that leads to wanting to make changes. So yeah, I wanted to talk about that because I've always been a very spiritual person ever since, I got into metaphysics in 1996. That's a long time.
Right.
My whole life has been spirituality and understanding the quantum realm and really just dissecting how this world works. And so I can't really separate out a whole lot of events anymore. Obviously my childhood had them, but as an adult, it's like, oh, when is the big event going to happen? And I've told David, I'm like, oh my gosh, Saturn's coming to, Saturn's the great, karmic manifester, like Saturn will bring things into physical reality better than any other planet. And so I'm like, yay, Saturn. And it's like, want, so
Sure.
I mean, as far as the physical manifestation, but it's not because things aren't physically manifesting. It's just how they've shown up has been really interesting. So, for example, I have a client who has become a little bit committed to the idea of not wanting to direct her life. Kind of, and this happens a lot with certain personality types where they don't want to be wrong about the decision. So they kind of just say, well, whatever's supposed to happen, right?
Hmm.
They have this laissez-faire attitude, and that's typically what they get is laissez-faire until a physical event hits them. And you can look to the chart and see that, if they get hit during a Pluto, Uranus, or Saturn transit, an event will manifest. But it's usually not a good event. It's usually like a what the F event.
Hmm.
And it happens to wake the person up. It doesn't happen to bring in, oh, I didn't know I wanted this. No, sorry, it doesn't work that way. It usually makes you go, wow, this happened to me. Wow, I didn't know this was possible. And it makes you reconcile your relationship to reality differently, okay? So like if someone were to die, if you were to lose your job, if you were to become extremely ill, these are all events that are going to make you look at how you live your life differently. And as a result, you take responsibility or not. But if you do, you take responsibility differently.
And
Now,
by that same token, I think it is also fair to acknowledge that in terms of events that correspond to transits, there are sometimes things like unplanned pregnancies that are welcome and that are
mhm,
considered good news. There are things like meeting a lover that can come to pass, which are considered happy and desirable and very welcome and positive news that wasn't necessarily an individual's plan when they were preparing for their day, but are very open to that experience. Winning the lottery is another example. It's impossible to plan for winning the lottery, and
right.
yet at the same time, we know that that's something that happens to some people. So I do think that it's useful to say that even if an event is happening and that the result is some kind of awakening, potentially, or has the potential for an awakening, even if the native has the ability to reject that potential and stay very much asleep, which is always an option. Nothing is ever going to force anybody awake. Even the worst tragedy in the world can't make you wake up if it's not what you want. But that's a useful thing to consider. Good things can happen very spontaneously and surprisingly, just as much as unwanted and unpleasant experiences. And the next thing that I would think is useful to bring into the conversation of manifestation is something that I fear is frequently very misunderstood by people who are semi-literate in terms of psychology, especially pop psychology. People who have watched Oprah for years and read a few Brene Brown books, so they know the word projection. And quite often when you hear this population, especially people who are in the metaphysical community, involved in New Age, readers of self-help books will sometimes talk about projection as though it's inherently pathological. And what I think is fair to acknowledge about projection is that without projection, there probably is no awareness whatsoever. If there is a phase of awareness beyond projection, it still doesn't eliminate projection as the first step in that direction. But what I think must be talked about in terms of events manifesting from astrological charts or from symbols that are represented in astrological charts, we have to take into consideration that a decision qualifies as an event. I stuttered there. Qualifies as an event. That's one. And two, projection is not pathological, it's natural. And three, there is always the potential to make a decision to direct a course of actions that is set in motion and has some momentum behind it. There is also the opportunity to not direct the momentum, which usually results in a crash that an astrologer is likely to call an event. So what we're talking about right now is that fate and free will are not mutually exclusive ideas. These are things that we as astrologers have to treat as working in tandem with each other.
Yeah, and well, I don't want to lose my train of thought before you go too far.
Please continue.
If you have an external event that you weren't prepared for, that's coming from the subconscious, so much more than the conscious mind. Would you agree, David?
Yeah.
Because it's something happening to reveal that shadow part that was looking for attention. So it's not that you didn't create it. You did, just not on a conscious level.
And I don't know how much more you would like to say about the subject before we go into today's example chart, but I do just want to say when we're talking about conscious and subconscious and or unconscious. Now, I, as more of a Jungian type of thinker, am more likely to say unconscious than subconscious. People who are a bit more Freudian are more likely to use subconscious. It's really just semantics and splitting hairs.
Yeah,
But,
to me the subconscious is just the unconscious.
right. But since we're roughly connecting on vocabulary, I do want to try to translate that into astrology, because it's very tempting for people to look at an astrology chart and think the sun is inherently conscious, or Venus. That obviously people are going to be conscious of the identity they want to form, what they like and dislike, what their personal value system and honor code looks like, and these kinds of ideas. And it's not necessarily
Until you read for them and you're like, what?
right. It's
you don't know.
and very frequently you get charts, especially in the case of people who have who are Saturn ruled, because they have multiple placements in Capricorn and Aquarius, or they have Saturn aspected to one of the luminaries, that it's really easy for those people to recite. And this is also true of Uranus. It's also somewhat true of Neptune, but it's so easy to recite what the values of the family are, or what the values of the immediate society are, and talk about things like, I believe in taking care of the environment. I believe in supporting the troops during wartime. I believe in investing my time and money into the people who are closest to me and always staying close to my relatives. And then sometimes an event happens that will typically correspond to a transit of one of the heavy-hitting planets, Chiron, Uranus, to something like the individual's moon, individual's Mars, whatever. Maybe even an outer planet that's in one of the angular houses, like the fourth or first house. And the experience that the individual takes away from that is, I didn't know that was important to me until it got run roughshod over and bulldozed. And then they discover a little bit about who they really are aside from that collective identity, and they begin to make that solar identity, the Venus identity, more conscious and more personal, instead of this abstract idea that at best manifests in their dreams, in their fantasies of who they could have been in another life, etc., etc. So we're always going to be looking at components of the astrological chart in the natality in terms of what's awake and what's not. And there's nothing in the astrological chart itself that says this is awake, this sun is definitely the embodiment of who this individual identifies as being, and they have nothing to do with their Jupiter. You're not going to see a chart that says that, and you'll have to ask the individual some questions, figure out some things about their background, figure out what their general beliefs about how they should carry themselves and their ideas of right and wrong, and then you can start to get an idea of what's conscious in the chart, which therefore they're going to be able to make decisions about, and what is less conscious in the chart, which the individual is going to be less decisive about and is going to experience transits to, most likely in the form of events that they identify as victims of, or as bystanders in the vicinity of.
Well, and I was going to say that as far as external events coming into the real world, like, whoa, there's typically an adjustment. Even if it's something you're like, oh, I guess I do want this. There is an adjustment period that you undergo with that. It's not like, oh, this is a great surprise, thank you, universe, and like life is great again. It's like it usually comes with a little bit of distress in the sense that you're giving up who you thought you were or what you thought you were. There's definitely an adjustment period that comes with it, even if it's a good event. But as far as things manifesting non-externally, yeah, the more conscious you are, and I can say this, the more conscious you are, the more events will turn up as just radical thinking change. Like, it's a very internal process. Like, you decide you want something, or you feel something, or something doesn't work anymore. And then as a result, you get an external event.
Right. Because that element of consciousness has enabled the decision-making process. So rather than, well, let's say sometimes people go to astrologers wondering, when am I going to get a job? And you might ask them things like, have you updated your resume with really relevant information and started sending it out to companies? And they might say no. Then at that point, the astrologer has to become kind of a surrogate mother figure instead of an oracle, and say something like, I don't think your astrology chart is going to help you get a job until you're taking some responsibility for setting things in the right direction. And we might say something like, this particular movement of an astrological body signifies an opportunity, and give a time frame for when that's going to come to pass. But it is not going to say, oh, you're definitely going to have a very high-paying job in July, and it's going to have opportunity for promotion in 2 years as you move into the management sector. That's not going to be very likely for the person who is not sending out a current resume and is not actively involved in their own job training at the time. But when an individual has that subject come into mind, that might say something about the ruler of the sixth house, which has to do with your daily work and your routines, being aspected by Saturn or Uranus or the transiting south node. It might have something to do with a planet starting to move into the 10th house, which has to do with your public image and how you would like for the world to perceive and receive you in the way that you're going to want to portray yourself to them. And then we can start asking some relevant questions based on that transit. What are you feeling inspired toward? And then might be able, instead of just prognosticating, no, you're doomed to be poor forever, or you're fated to be extremely famous and make wonderful contributions to society, and that's going to start in 3 years. We can actually say, what kind of training are you considering in terms of preparing for the next chapter of your life?
And I remember one of my ex-boyfriends, very Sag, I think like 5 Sag placements or something.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So, and just to update you, Sagittarius is Jupiter, which in a nutshell can be an incredibly optimistic energy, but it's not a very grounded, rooted in reality kind of energy. So, I remember him telling me, oh yeah, I read with this astrologer, and it was a Vedic astrologer, and he said that I'm going to be wealthy and marry a blonde. And I remember thinking, okay, then what are you doing about it? And nothing. He wasn't doing anything about it. He just anticipated that this was just going to fall on his lap at some point. And that's the problem, is that, like, if you just expect that, like, I have this, I don't have to do anything. One of the biggest things I teach my coaching clients who get frustrated with this alternate universe they want to just appear. It's like, well, are you bulldozing the mountain so it can appear? Are you creating the neural pathway so it can, line up in your world? Because if you're not actually bringing it closer to your reality. I don't care like what the potential the chart says. It can go either way. If you're not working your own potential and showing up and using your will and taking responsibility, it doesn't matter. So that's
Yeah.
like a pet peeve of my own, where if you have, for me, I love looking at transits because it tells me, ooh, I have an opportunity to break through this area big time, or to really build in this particular area, and that's nice. I like to work my transits, but I work my transits. I don't just sit around and wait for an event to wake me up. And I wanted to talk about that because I think on some level, most of us, whether we would consciously identify with it or not, feel like we're a victim of something, circumstance, our gender, our identity, our religion, our family. We just, on some low level plane, we all kind of think we're a victim of something. And we're just hoping to not be, instead of working through that victimization energy and taking responsibility. And so, the transits can go either way. I mean, and if it becomes an internal shift of, oh, I need to take responsibility for this. Yeah, if you work it, you'll get exactly what you want. You know what I mean? It won't just be like this, car hitting you and going, oh, maybe I should fix that or change that. You know what I mean? Plus a mess to clean up. And that's a lot of times how those events manifest is messy. Not always, but they can be very messy. And, it also goes to show, and this is kind of going to lead into the chart we're going to look at, but it also goes to show just how much do we think that we are above natural law? How much do we think that we're above the rules of the universe? How much do we think that our ego is somehow in control when we are 100% connected at all times to what we're creating, and how that can massively backfire?
Right. And what I do want to say, because you mentioned Vedic astrology, and I know you know this, but the listening audience may not know that there are a lot of differences.
Like it.
Aha,
Don't
sure.
like it.
There are a lot of differences between the way that astrology is practiced in the West and the way that it's practiced in the Vedic system. And to be fair, making a prediction like the one that was just described, that, here you're going to have this job falling in your lap in thus and such a time frame, may have actually been practical for someone who was oriented to that particular society, because that would have been someone who was taken to an astrologer as a child, and the parents would have been told, this child must be occupied in activities where they can use their hands constantly, because this is a great area of skill. Or this is a child that needs to be trained in religion because the chart shows a tremendous amount of wisdom and the ability to teach. Or this is a child that has to be saturated in the sciences because they have genius level intelligence and a great deal of inventiveness, or something to the effect, so that by the time the astrologer were to make a prediction such as, here's this job opportunity that's happening in thus and such a time frame, the skills were already in place for that. Or at the very least, the individual would have had resources available to look for the training, and it wouldn't be a new idea. It wouldn't be like your client is a chemist and you're telling them, oh, I know you're a chemist now, but in 2 years you're going to be a psychotherapist. That would be absurd, because that's an individual who is not prepared to make that kind of lifestyle and career change in such a short time. Whereas in the Vedic system, there would have been a long period of preparation already that would have started by taking the child to an astrologer very early in their life. That doesn't happen as much in the West, and there are a lot of good reasons that it shouldn't. But even our method of calculating a sign placement is mathematically different than how Vedic astrology works, and there's drastic differences, and therefore there are also drastic differences between how Vedic astrologers make predictions and how Western astrologers ought to think about the process of doing predictive work. And Paige, would you like to make any more comments before we look at today's example chart?
Besides the fact that I just really don't like Vedic astrology. I mean, and I say that because my transit expressions in Western astrology have been so on point the very day that, you know, for someone to, and I find them to be a little bit arrogant to say, oh, no, we're the correct ones. We are deciding that because of this wobble in the Earth's axis, that everything should be 17 degrees behind, and that's accurate. And, you know, it's like, I tried it a few times, and tried if you're interested. I just found Vedic astrology to be incredibly fatalistic. It's very like, oh no, you're doomed. Kind of. I mean, they'll talk to you like that. It's not very opportunistic in their verbiage, and I find that very depressing. And then this is just a personal story, but when I was talking to a friend of mine who is Indian, and, you know, it's part of his culture. And he was like, yeah, he goes, but I talked to my Vedic astrologer, and he told me straight up that the Vedic system was designed around the caste system. Like it was actually designed, and it was meant to, you know, hold certain people on pedestals and other people to remind them their place in line. And kind of once I understood that part, it made more sense to me, you know, that like, okay, well, you know, that's probably why I don't resonate with it, because it's so karmic, but not karmic in the way that I understand karma, but, you know, karmic in the sense that you are bound. It's not changeable. It's not something that can be transformed. It is 100% cause and effect. And I know too much about quantum physics to think that way. So
right. And I do think it is useful to acknowledge, and what you're hearing right now is all of the Libra in my chart, because I really want to look at and expand on both sides of every single subject that has ever existed.
And I don't.
Right? But of course, one of Paige's astrologers named Jewel is kind of 50-50 Vedic and Western astrology. And this is a reflection of the fact that many people who are in Vedic astrology are following along the lines of what Western astrology has done in the last century or 150 years, which is shift from a more causal perspective of interpretation and what the significance of astrological movements is to a slightly more internal one, which involves the involvement of the soul, the involvement of consciousness, the involvement of decision, and the establishment of a personal preference, and how to apply that to the world.
It's your will.
Yes.
The will.
Yes, the will. It's included. And I think that Vedic astrology is trying to start including that more in a way that it hasn't previously. But even for the mainstream of Western astrology, including will has only been a thing for max 2 centuries. We could say that astrology in the West had basically come to a halt until Helena Petronova Blavatsky brought theosophy to the mainstream in the last century. Theosophy brought about esoteric astrology, or what has been called that, which, you know, I have my complaints about esoteric astrology, and I'm maybe going to expand on those at a later point in time, not in this conversation today. But then we had people like Ebertine, and then people like Dane Rudyard later on, who actually brought it full circle into the sphere of consciousness. And now astrologers are getting a very much clearer picture about how that which is considered purely external and that which is very much internal and personal have a series of correspondences. So the astrological chart that Paige and I have decided we wanted to talk about with you is a controversial one. I don't think that we're going to do much shying away from controversy in the topics we approach, although we might try to stay neutral in terms of personal stances for the most part. This is the astrological chart of Jussie Smollett. So I am bringing it up for you right now. And actually, this is the progress chart. I want the natal.
I was going to say, like, I'm not a huge fan of the fact that, like, we all share the same birth year.
Right. But even I am in the process of reading Liz Green's book concerning predictive astrology. It's just lectures that have been transcribed into a book. But she mentions on several occasions in a few books that even just having a single placement different can totally affect the individual's worldview and the individual's personal experience in early life in such a profound way that it can be the difference between one person being relatively societally integrated and another person being constantly on edge or over the edge of psychotic breakdown.
Oh, I know. I'm just making a bad joke.
Right.
I mean, he's the same age as us.
Yeah, and maybe the same age as a lot of listeners too. But as most of you know, there's not a whole lot of you who have been accused of framing a fault or staging a false attack in order to further your career in show business. So take that as a little tone of confidence. Where I want to start with this chart, and Paige, feel free to interrupt at any time and throw anything at us, at me, that jumps out at you, is that transiting Neptune, which at the time, this chart is cast for January 29th, which was the day that Smollett filed a police report on the alleged attack that occurred. Neptune had just passed square to his ascendant-descendant axis. Now, Neptune has everything to do with the politics of sacrifice, the politics of being a victim, the politics of being somehow a voluntary scapegoat. And when we're looking at the way that it aspects the ascendant and descendant, you'll see that this individual is so identified at the particular time of this transit with Neptune in the 10th house, exemplifying the ability to portray glamour in a very public way and receive a great deal of media attention, with a completely artificial portrayal of the self and artificial portrayal of self in relationship to other. So we're dealing with a completely illusory presentation that is based on probably a great deal of insecurity. And when you're looking at themes like that, you also want to go into other transits that have related ideas. Paige, before I continue, do you want to say anything?
Oh, just that instead of, the portray he wanted, all he ended up was portraying a lot of confusion and deception.
Absolutely, which most astrologers who are of a psychological orientation agree is the shadow side of a Neptune expression. But I was saying to Paige just before we started recording that what I would consider the most important aspect in this chart is Venus conjunct Chiron in the 12th house. I am hovering my cursor over that conjunction right now. It is at 25 degrees and 15 minutes of Taurus for the Venus placement, 25 degrees and 16 minutes for the Chiron placement. They're right on top of each other. And when you have the relationship between Venus and Chiron to be aspected, then what you're dealing with is the question of what gives me value, what makes me important, what makes me significant, what kind of contribution am I capable of making, what esteems me in the perspective of others, with the concept of the scapegoat, the victim, to some extent the saboteur. These are all archetypes that we associate with Chiron. Chiron represents, to a greater or lesser degree, a wound that doesn't get completely fixed in a traditional sense and leaves a permanent mark. So what we do have is a somewhat irreconcilable ability, or irreconcilable loss of self-worth that somehow has to be accommodated and allowed to exist within consciousness in order for it to be integrated in a way that doesn't cause rampant destruction, as an unintegrated Chiron usually does. In this particular case, it is tucked away in the 12th house, where it's very easy to ignore until something terrible happens.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at this person who very likely thinks little of themselves, except when they have opportunities to prove, I'm worth something, I'm valuable, please look at me, I'm being pretty for you, I'm earning money, I'm doing all of the things that cause a person to esteem themselves and be esteemed in society. Am I not important enough yet? And when we look at some of the information that's come out in media, these were the kinds of thoughts that probably were going through Smollett's mind, because we do have certain voices who have reported that Smollett sent the fake letter to himself at Fox Studios because he felt like he should be getting a more competitive salary with his castmates on the TV show Empire. And he was getting a lesser pay scale, and he was bitter about it. He felt like Fox should have taken the hate mail more seriously, and because they didn't, allegedly, and keep in mind, a lot of this is hearsay, a lot of it's speculative, but that was when the attack got staged. So this is so much about a competition for importance by portraying oneself as a kind of freedom fighter. Because if you remember the dialogue, what was it that he told the news media that he said to the attacker? Something like, I'm the gay Tupac. Was that right?
I don't remember, but you're in, just so everyone knows, you're in Chicago where he lives.
That's correct.
So you got a lot more news than we did, like directly. I mean, I know you probably don't subscribe to the news, but you would know better than anyone, I would think.
And Chicago didn't take the event very seriously from the start, because in Chicago, if you go out in public, especially in the neighborhood where this particular attack allegedly happened, it's a neighborhood called Streeterville. It's one of the more upscale commercial neighborhoods in Chicago. Most of the residences are high rises with doormen and that kind of thing. And you're much more likely to get attacked there for wearing a MAGA hat than you are for being homosexual and ethnic.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is nothing about Chicago in general or Streeterville specifically that one could call MAGA country. So Chicago dismissed that immediately.
Mm-hmm. He has his sun, his moon, his Mercury, and his ascendant all in Gemini, and then he's also got he's got his sun conjunct his moon, and then he's got his sun and his moon opposite Neptune,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is interesting. So there's a lot. I would feel like there's a lot of confusion around his identity, his security, what resonates with feeling safe, how he projects himself, and on all those things. I would think that there would be just a tremendous amount of confusion with that Neptune going on, and people probably don't see him very well either. Like, he probably has been wrestling with the fact that he's not seen. If he has any idea of who he is, he probably feels like he's misread constantly.
I would agree with that very much. And we also see that same point, just to reinforce what you're already saying, we see that reinforced by the fact that the sun, moon, and ascendant are disposed by Mercury. And disposed basically is an astrological term for ruled. But then the placement of that ruler directs its energy somewhere else, and where that's directed is into the 12th house, maybe it's useful for us to spend a few moments talking about the 12th house. I think that the most basic way to say it, that someone who is not particularly astrologically or psychologically literate could understand it, is to say it's the personal blind spot, because it is where you've defaulted to ages and ages and ages of family and society's patterning that are so ingrained in your DNA and your cell tissue that it doesn't even cross your mind that something else could be so, and you don't even know that you're doing it because it happens on autopilot. So the only thing that's wrong with that is that it doesn't leave any room for decision. Anything that's placed in the 12th house is going to be as automatic as the assumption that I'm born into this species that has fingers and therefore I'm going to use them. So It's kind of like also saying, I'm born into this family that has a long-standing pattern, because we're looking at a fixed sign placement in the 12th house, of believing that society is going to make a scapegoat out of me, and that my value is both contradicted and tied to that dynamic of scapegoating. So, and we talked about that placement before, but also...
Well, I'm familiar with not the conjunction, but the square between Venus and Chiron personally.
Would you like to say any more about that right now? I'd be interested to hear.
I can definitely tell you that with the Venus Chiron energy that's that tight, whether it's square or conjunction or even opposition, I suppose, it's because any transit or aspect can go either way. And in this case, for myself, I was the family scapegoat my whole life. And like, Jussie's obviously playing into it. I wasn't playing into it, but I had big time power struggle trying to get out of it. And it was just, I feel like I've only really just completely exited out of that identification 100% in the last 6 months of my life. And I've been working on that one since I was about 20. Okay. So understanding that when people look at me, for example, and they don't like what they see, they're automatically going to label me as, oh, well, you must be wrong, or it's your fault, because they don't want to look at their own shadow. So that's how you become the scapegoat. is, it's just the person that gets blamed for everything because you make them too uncomfortable. And so to wrestle with that energy is quite exhausting. And ironically, this is what's really interesting. No matter how hard I tried to just play the victim role, no one would sympathize with me ever in my entire life. Would anyone ever sympathize with me, even when it was legit? And interestingly enough, when I got assaulted in January, that's when I really erased that whole pattern completely. And that's when I got more sympathy than I've ever had. So that's the irony of a defense mechanism. But in his case, he's trying to play the victim and it completely backfired.
Right. And there's very little sympathy left.
Yeah.
So just to keep myself on track, because I can go on about a variety of astrological factors incessantly, and I really want to keep myself a little bit focused, but just reinforcing what Paige was talking about with the sun and moon being so tight with each other, opposed by Neptune, which has something to do with a blurred vision of solar consciousness, which represents what I see myself as wanting to become, and lunar consciousness, which is what I default to when I think nobody's looking. And when you have those so tight with each other, there's really no difference. It's kind of like it's saying, I just want to be what I am. And when that's in Gemini, what I am is relating one-on-one with everything in my immediate environment all the time in order to form a concept of my immediate role in that environment. So every relationship is a case-by-case basis, but what is the basis of that when you have the disposer of those planets placed in the 12th house? One probably doesn't know until one gets a significant hit to that disposer. And once again, anytime something is starting to move to an angular configuration with Mercury, it's not going to be long until it hits the ascendant. And then depending on which planet we're talking about, only 1 to 5 years later before it moves within orb of aspect to the sun and moon, which are only 6 minutes apart in this chart. So right now we have Neptune that's playing that role, and we can look a little bit into the progress chart because there's some interesting things going on there too.
Well, yeah, and that Neptune has been squaring that ascendant.
Yes.
Which basically puts a veil around whatever appearances he tries to make, or creates the confusion, that deception again. But
yes.
Also, well, who is this guy? What is he doing? Why is he doing it? What is he up to? Like, it would put people in that frame of reference to ask those questions with him. And I just want to say one thing I think is kind of interesting is, and he's not a serial killer by any means, but you've seen that list of serial killers and how they're all mutable signs.
Yeah.
And Virgo is the most. But he has a lot of Gemini. And the thing about mutable energy is it's not stable. And he has a lot of mutable energy in his chart. And it's not a stable energy. It's a flexible energy, but it's not a stable energy. And I think that's really interesting, especially with it being the sun, the moon, the ascendant, and Mercury. So that's, how I see myself, how others see me, what I find in terms of security, and how I think. That's all in Gemini. It's all very mobile. So to break it down, Gemini is like the salesman of the chart. Gemini can sell smo to an Eskimo. Gemini can talk their way into and out of anything. They're very slick in that way. I want to say slippery, but that's more Pisces. So they're quick to maneuver in and out of. And I just think that's an interesting thing to point out given who we're dealing with.
Absolutely.
He just chose the wrong time to be slick, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if there would be a right time for that.
Definitely not when Neptune is aspecting all of that.
No, that's right. And if I had to give a basic description for what I think a planet behaves like when it's in Gemini, I would say that that planet is taking on an intellectually receptive position in order to understand its role and its duty through contrast to the environment. So that's one of the reasons I think that the third house is associated with uh, public school, associated with your neighborhood, associated with the adolescence phase of life, because that's the point at which, okay, I'm an individual, I have a body, and I have some stuff, some possessions, and here's other people, and they have stuff that's theirs. What's the relationship? And I think that's the question that Gemini is asking anytime there's a placement there. So you're already getting a sense of identity that can be vague and changeable, and that's one of the reasons that Gemini has a reputation for being flaky in pop astrology. And before anybody thinks that I'm just hating on Gemini, Gemini is my sun sign by birth. I also have my Mercury placed there. And so this is not necessarily a personal attack on Gemini. Moving a little bit further ahead into how things are distributed in this chart, what we do have is that Jupiter just barely made it into Scorpio, and that is the only water representation in this chart. So we have Jupiter that by element is what astrologers call a singleton, which is the only representation in a specific modality or element of sign. So it very likely is not going to be very well integrated into the whole of the personality. And when you have a planet that is a singleton or unaspected, it usually tends to behave autonomously, and the individual doesn't know that it belongs to them. Meanwhile, you have some more planets in air. Over here, you have Mercury, Sun, and Moon in Gemini, in addition to the ascendant. Over here, you have Mars, Saturn, Pluto in Libra. So that makes 6 planets at an angle in air, 1 planet barely in water. So the elements are very distorted. So one could even go as far as to say that if Smollett had been able to have factors in place that would reaffirm his sense of value in a way that would foster his self-esteem and his self-confidence, he still wouldn't have been able to feel that and let that register into the emotional level, because all that's going to move through those Gemini placements where there's going to be more comparing and contrasting, and this one's making more money, and this one has more fame, and this one gets more jobs more easily, and what's wrong with me that would be preventing me from getting ahead in a world where everybody else gets ahead? It must be sexuality, ethnicity, politics, etc., etc. And here came an opportunity to challenge the system in a not especially healthy way.
Well, his progressed moon was also in Scorpio during this.
And I'll switch over to the progress chart since you're speaking about that now. Is there anything else that you would like to say about the progressed moon, or perhaps about the progressed chart, because we have not talked about progressions on this recording before?
No, I don't actually follow progressions too much, because personally, to me, progressions are like third series astrology, and I still consider myself primary intermediate practitioner. So,
Okay.
but I do know that the moon definitely plays a strong role in progressions, because progressions are the emotional experience behind our transits. I know that much about them. And that when the moon changes signs, it's pretty it's pretty obvious. I know when my moon went into Virgo, I was all about trying to get my diet cleaned up. Like overnight, no problem. Didn't want sugar anymore. Like just, and I remember thinking my moon must have gone into Virgo, and it did. Like literally, I could feel it. And so with his moon in Scorpio, that shadow side or lower octave of Scorpio could certainly play out a little bit of that, big middle finger attitude towards life in general. That Scorpio energy can be a little bit vindictive.
Sure. And not only that, but one thing that should be taken into consideration is that the progressed moon moves at a rate of approximately 1 degree per month. So because of that, we can know that it was in an exact conjunction with his progressed Jupiter about 7 months ago. So sometime late last summer. Let's go back to my share because that was not what I meant to do. Sorry about that. I wanted to get back to our natal.
The natal chart.
Yes, and right now I'm growling because my ability to use technology is extraordinarily poor, apparently. So, and 0 degrees in the natal. So, obviously, the further out a planet gets, the less it's going to move in the progress chart during the course of one's entire lifetime. So, within 6, 7, 8 months, Moon past Jupiter. Jupiter, as we just described, is mostly dormant in this chart. And it being so, we have to take into consideration that it's going to come back awake with a vengeance. And it's going to say, I am important. I am somebody. Because, like, I'm the king of the gods. I'm significant. Everybody should know this.
Mm-hmm.
And mythological Jupiter punished people for not acknowledging his importance and pretty much took everything he wanted, whether anybody else thought it was a good idea or not. So that's the kind of energy that's getting active. And it's not going to be a conscious energy. It's going to act autonomically through him because water is dormant in his chart. And not only that, but we also have the moon having just taken a square to the natal sun and to the natal Mercury, which are in the first house, in Leo in the progress chart, which once again are going to say, look at me, acknowledge me, I'm here, pay attention, I need your love, public. Right? So we have a lot of very interesting psychology to think about in terms probably of the formation of any crime. But this one is especially telling because we get all the unique twists of feelings of failure, feelings of inadequacy, urgent needs for validation, inability to feel support from other people at the emotional level, and the sense of desperation that can be born of that in order to get the validation that's going to perform a containing function for the identity that is so malformed to begin with.
Yeah, did you want to look into the transits as it has gone on? I
Sure.
think I just think it's interesting that like at 21 degrees was Pluto getting ready to make its way up to that square he's got, which is a big life-changing overhaul, Pluto transits.
That's right.
And
Should we look for and I don't mean to cut you off, but if you'd like, what I can do is I can change the reference date on the transit chart for the day of the indictment while you continue forming that thought.
Sure. I mean, because right now we've got Pluto at 22 and his Pluto at 24. So it's not going to hit this year, but it's going to get really close. And I'm more sensitive. I know you are too. So for me, I usually feel things within 2 to 3 degree orbs, but like some people might feel them a little bit further out, or they might have an event. That's what I want to say that triggers what's coming far out. I've known people who've had that, and then it's like, wow, where'd that come from? And then you see, oh, well, Pluto's getting ready to square something in your chart. And so I think that timing is really interesting as well. And the fact that he's got Chiron squaring that Sun Moon conjunction, his by transit. And then what was the other one that I saw? I think that was like the main one I wanted to look at.
And so I've changed the reference date on the chart, and I am about to share the new chart, which has transits for February 20th, which was the day that charges were brought against Jussie. And the day following, the 21st, was the day that Smollett turned himself into police. So when Paige was talking about Chiron, that's where I have my cursor hovering right now. Chiron, for anyone who has not been following astrology very long, is considered a minor planetoid, which is between the orbits of Saturn and Uranus. And it is, if I'm not mistaken, it's supposedly slightly larger than Pluto and is the, let's see, some people call it a comet rather than a planetoid. But even the fact that nobody agrees on what it is says something about its personality.
Right.
In any case, though, that square that Paige was talking about means a 90-degree angle from this spot that looks like a key. It looks like an old school key, making about a 90-degree angle at the end of Pisces, beginning of Aries, to this Sun-Moon conjunction in the first house. And should we talk a little bit about what we mean when we say things like square, opposition, trine, etc.?
That's the distance between two planets. Like square, opposition, those are all different forms of aspects. Right?
Right. And most of us agree that the conjunction aspect represents something about fusion, so that planets which are conjunct have to operate in tandem with each other and don't necessarily perceive themselves as being separate. Planets that are in opposition have a tendency to see each other as completely separate, even if maybe harmonious, still divided. And planets that are in trine, which is about a 120 degree angle, are considered to have some kind of free-flowing, harmonious correspondence between them. And those are represented in this chart as these blue lines. Opposition is represented as the very long red line. Square is represented as the shorter red line. In any case, though, what we consider the square aspect to represent is friction. And normally the way that friction manifests is that an individual pulls in to one end of the square at the exclusion of the other. And typically squares are good at signifying events in astrology because of the fact that one side of the square is very likely to be perceived as only outside oneself and therefore not something that one can consciously navigate.
Yeah, squares, oppositions, and conjunctions also kind of force you to look at things. Wouldn't you say? It's you can't get around them. Whereas trines and sextiles, that you can miss them if you want.
Yeah, that's true.
It's kind of like if you're driving and you're not paying attention to what's on the side of the road, you'll miss it. But if you're driving and there's construction and you have to go around, you're not going to miss it. You know what I mean? So to me, that's kind of like the difference between the two.
But I would also say, just as a qualifier, that even though you're not going to miss a square in the context of being oblivious to the principles that this astrological angle represents when you have it represented in your chart, whether in the natal chart or by transit, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to take that opportunity to become more conscious. What it does instead say is that you're going to notice that this is uncomfortable and that it requires some adjustment on your part. But
Yeah, it
if
could
your
just put you in a
astrologer asks you, does this have anything to do with you? You absolutely have the opportunity to live in that shadow space and say, oh no, that's everybody else except for me. This has nothing to do with my decisions or my thought processes.
Yeah, no, it could, for someone who's very unconscious, it could just put them in a really bad mood and reinforce victimization and reinforce the lack of responsibility. It could go that way too. So
Right. So there wasn't necessarily, obviously, under the Chiron square sun moon, we did not see a lot of long-term planning for how am I going to get my career comparable to my higher paid coworkers. We instead saw, how can I get a big political boost fast?
yeah, and it's interesting because with every level of my own growth, it's kind of funny. It's like, no, here's an opportunity page to like practice good communication, or here's an opportunity to like try to present yourself differently, and obviously he wasn't in the space of wanting to negotiate with his bosses. He just wanted to, have someone take pity on him and somehow get paid that way. I'm gonna let you talk. I'm gonna, lock Charlie out because he's driving me nuts. Hold on.
Ah, okay. And Charlie is Paige's younger and more energetic cat. But as we continue looking into what this chart has to offer us, we again see not only is the sun moon making that opposition aspect a little bit widely. What did I just do? I don't think I want that. I don't think I want that. Okay.
Yeah, who needs a child when you have a Charlie?
So where I wanted to go is we have these green dotted lines that this chart shows, which form an aspect pattern that's called a yod. And the yod is two 150-degree angles, which astrologers call a quincunx or an inconjunct. I like the term quincunx because it's very literal. It literally means 5/12 between Pluto, Neptune, and Venus Chiron. So we could almost say for persons born in 1982, the yod of Neptune, Pluto, Chiron could be considered a generational aspect and something that is relevant to everybody that was born within a period of several months, because those planets move at roughly the same speed and they're going to dance retrograde back and forth within to orb of aspect to each other for quite an extended period. But what we have in this chart is Venus gets involved too. So once again, we have Neptune that blurs the lines of identity and contradicts the world of form. And you could say interrupts the boundary in between what's fantasy and what's real. And its placement is true for society because it represents how glamour is formed. It represents what trends are going to move through the fashion industry and what your TV commercials are going to look like. It goes through one sign and everything is sexy. It goes through another sign and everything is healthy. It goes through another sign and makes a different angle to Uranus, and everything has to do with what the right political vision happens to be that makes you attractive and popular and brings you into a harmonious existence, right? So Pluto, by contrast, has a lot to do with secrets. It has to do with what is conditioned to be hidden. It has to do with where power is the most dominant issue and can be used overtly or covertly depending on what the circumstance is. And that sextile between them was very, very, very long running. It was operative for years. Chiron moved into that 150-degree angle between both of them for a period in 82, and Venus conjoined it. So what you see then is that this Venus-Chiron conjunction is not only very powerful in and of itself, but it's very powerful in reference to this generational aspect of Pluto-Neptune sextile. And the reason that it is so relevant and so powerful is because it becomes the channel through which Neptune and Pluto energies have to be focused in order to be acknowledged. So, poor Smollett, I really feel for him when I look at this chart. It's easy to just get angry at someone who plays such a deceptive and expensive trick uh, on a city, on so many different people's business and employment status, you know, in terms of who worked on the television show with him and the Fox network that aired it. But look at the deep-seated insecurities that are so rampant in this chart and undeniably powerful, and how they're not only his, they're really the insecurities of a generation that he just happened to be born at the right time to become the most literal embodiment of and identify with in an extremely personal way. It's possible for the rest of us who were all born, pretty much anyone in their 30s has the Pluto-Neptune sextile. And we can say good things about it or bad things about it depending on how it aspects the other planets in our chart. But what we have is that those two are really trying to shut down his Venus Chiron in order to become the autonomous voice. And I find that so alarmingly powerful.
One thing that I think is interesting, though, is that and the more I study victimization, the more I see this is, you know, and I say this to my coaching clients, it's like, you're not that special. And I think that there's like grandiose in how he operated here in terms of how special he thought he was and maybe getting away with this or getting what he wanted out of this. And I'm not saying victims don't exist, because they do. You know, there are real victims out there, but it's how we identify with that role and what we do with it that kind of will make or break it. And obviously in this case, he was making himself extra special, and it really just didn't work against, or didn't work for him. he could have probably taken the exact same aspects that he was going through and moved it into a sort of collective theme of how to break free from this energy and done some real good with it. But instead, he chose to make it about himself, and because the energies are there, right?
Yes.
So, but he could have done something else with it on a grander scale to show maybe some sort of like true victimization in the world or something along those lines, and gotten that publicity. Because he got publicity, he could have gotten that publicity, but he could have completely shifted that dynamic and it could have gone the other way. But instead, he chose to make it very much about himself and his own personal needs. And I think when we identify as victims, we become very selfish. We don't recognize that we are a part of the whole, and that by being victim, we contract and we create a vacuum instead of actually helping society by moving out of victimization. So he could have gone the other way too, and it probably would have had a massive impact, but in the other way.
And there was missed opportunity there. You're absolutely right in what you are pointing out. And I'm going to show the progress chart one more time so that we can talk about those movements that you were starting to allude to before. Progressed moon had, by this point in time, made it to, and this is January, had made it to 8 degrees of Scorpio. That had just activated his Jupiter, which we talked about being an unconscious singleton planet, which is very likely to bring up certain feelings of grandiosity and need for attention, need for power, need for reward. And it had also just squared, let's stop clicking things I don't want to click. It had also squared Sun and Mercury in the progress chart, which are in Leo in the first house. Again, thirsty for attention. Look at me, please. So it's absolutely fascinating, but also kind of creepy and alarming to think about how literally some people enact certain astrological transits as they occur. Because you're almost left with the question, what would it have taken for Smollett to do something else with these transits? Would it have taken some years of therapy? Would it have taken devotion to a prayer discipline? Would it have taken a different kind of childhood? We have no idea what it would have taken. We only know he had the life he had the chart he had, and he acted out these particular astrological movements in the most literal way imaginable, probably without knowing a single thing about his astrology chart, as most people who do drastic things don't.
Well, but still, it's very fascinating to me that, like, here is a guy who, I mean, he really has achieved so much. You know what I mean? Like, he's living a very good life. He's got he's on a network. He's a movie star. But it wasn't enough for him, right? And so he played on that insecurity of it not being enough and went totally into the black hole of, like, making it more about himself. And his ego worked against him, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make, is that, like, the reality is he was important, but not important enough to his egocentrism.
Right.
And
And egocentrism isn't inherently dangerous in everybody's chart, but it's very dangerous when it is operating in tandem with the question, who am I? And that is left unanswered.
well,
And
and
this
I'm not
chart
saying
doesn't provide that container.
yeah, no, egocentrism isn't really bad in general until we kind of get enough of our conditioning out of the way. It's how we all operate.
Sure.
But I'm just saying, like, he could have gone, okay, I'm feeling restless, before I do something stupid. Are there other ways to get attention? I mean, in this day and age, like, we have cameras on cameras. Like, and that's why I think that whole Neptune thing, the Neptune energy on him, it really just made it so that that clarity wasn't there. That perception of reality was really fogged. It's like when I'm thinking about doing something big, I'm like, where's Neptune? Then we just see where Neptune is first, because
Oh,
you know what I mean?
yeah.
I don't, and I mean, I do astrology, so I know to do that. But, you know, he obviously was not in a good space to even assume that in this day and age that, like, the forensics behind anything anymore is just so acute and so refined that it's like, how do you think you're going to get away with that?
And you did bring up one important point, that with consciousness, it's possible to say, I feel restless. What can I do with that feeling? But when we go into feelings, we're acknowledging the water element of the chart. And
Mm-hmm.
this was a person who had one natal water singleton planet, and it was not necessarily the most personal or sensitive of planets. It's really the first of the planets that represents something about society, and
Yeah.
that is Jupiter. So it's kind of like that has to do with what I personally, my philosophy of right. That's a good way to describe what natal Jupiter is. It's my philosophy of what is correct and what makes another person morally correct and justified and deserving of existence and that sort of thing. When it's in
Well,
Scorpio, it doesn't necessarily make a person emotionally sensitive enough to immediately notice I'm feeling restless until I'm feeling restless becomes a big smack upside the head. And if
well,
you're
and I
not
was
lucky enough to get that smack upside the head, it's probably a collision course toward an event.
Well, and that's exactly what I was going to say was, the unconscious part of him got a wake up call big time,
Yeah.
big time. I mean, you can't outrun your ego. So if you feel I have to do this, I should do this, take that thought apart, look at it from multiple sides first, examine your motives, just FYI, people, because you can't outrun the ego.
Right.
You're
And
not
just to
separate from your actions and thoughts, unfortunately. So yeah, he got events. He got real life events.
bring the conversation full circle before we start winding up, which I think we should close the conversation quite soon. The way that I would phrase that statement Paige just made in my own vocabulary is you can't outrun your outconscious or your unconscious. Outconscious. Maybe I should write a book and coin that term. It'll
Out
be very
conscious.
famous. Right.
Because that's what everyone wants to do. They want to like push it out. It's not me.
Right. Well, you can't unrun. Oh, wow. What's happening to me?
Can't unrun your out conscious.
Yes. I wonder if I'm having a
Mercury
Neptune
moment.
Mercury aspect today. Right. You can't outrun your unconscious.
Nope. It'll catch up with you, and it's usually not pretty.
Right. And it gets complicated because even Jung was not particularly an advocate for picking at the unconscious and giving it the timing where it's going to give up the goods. And many of us who have been in various kinds of mindful practice have tried that for a very long time, thinking this specific part of the self is supposed to heal now. I want to be aware of XYZ. I want to understand the foundation of this behavior and this belief, and I want clarity to come right now. And we don't necessarily get to dictate that timing any more than we get to dictate when. Right. So
I'm obsessed with knowing.
right. Tell me now.
I want to know. I want to know why.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I feel
that's
like I feel like people like David and myself, our greatest addiction is to knowing. Like when you
Yeah.
become really conscious, the addiction it goes from like major distraction or unhealthy distraction to just I want to know why that happened, and I want to know what I can do to prevent the next one, and like it just you become obsessed with understanding reality.
And which, just so the listening audience knows that that's not a concept that we're glamorizing, that's
No,
still another form of egoic control.
sure, absolutely.
Right.
I'm just
So,
now starting to kind of graduate from caring about knowing.
right.
But it seems to be what we do when we're like trying to outsmart
Yes.
the universe, and yet, we still get our little surprises too.
Right. And it's really interesting. We can so easily see a Neptune transit or a Pluto transit coming up and start thinking, okay, I'm gonna get ready to surrender right now so that this hurts less. And it's almost like it's almost like when we're doing that, our willful identity, which is what I call the ego, is trying to tell the unconscious, now you surrender, you son of a bitch. You cough up the goods. And it doesn't work because, I mean, seriously, try bringing the emotional responses into line with the logic and let me know how far you get. I really don't have a lot of confidence in that process.
No, hindsight is definitely 2020.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I've gotten really good, but I've gotten really good at just accepting what is, I think. I've gotten a lot better at accepting the moments as opposed to like assuming what they're going to be like. It's always hindsight is 2020, even still.
Well, I can only say good for you, Paige. I still have a way to go on that one.
Hey, but you know what? Like I've learned how to deal with Pluto. Saturn, I've generally speaking always kind of liked.
Hmm.
Um, Saturn is funny because I feel like Saturn just tells you what room in your life to clean up. Like, okay, put your attention there and now do that. And I'm really good at doing those things. I'm like, oh, I have lots of energy. Let me use it. I'll go over there. Um, Uranus, I can't really say here or there. Neptune, I'm a little nervous about. Whenever a planet hits my Neptune, it's usually messy. So, because it's just all confusion for me. And so I think when Neptune moves maybe into Aries, it's going to be a tough decade again.
Mm.
When I get all those cardinal hits again from Neptune, that might be a little interesting.
At
So,
least it'll go by a little faster.
yeah, but Neptune moves really slow too.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Neptune just throws you into confusion and just that veil energy. It's really, when people get involved under Neptune, you know how that's going to end.
Mm.
I mean, I have yet to meet anyone who met under a Neptune transit and it turned out good. I don't know if most of us are conscious going into those, but it's a lot of reality checks at the end of it.
Which I love that you brought that up because it sort of ties into what I was starting to mention earlier. It's very common for esoteric astrologers to say that Neptune is the planet that rules spirituality and unconditional love, and that if you're having a Neptune transit, that it's an opportunity to shed your ego and become enlightened. And more often than not, what happens is that the individual
You
just
can't see
completely
clearly.
puts on a disguise, and not only can't see clearly, but also wants to be unseen and is really by all means like allowing something else that is probably very unconscious or completely artificial to move through the body as if it were the ego, when it really isn't the ego consciousness. It's not something that's making a decision. It's not a true reflection of who I am and what I think and be and do and feel. It is what I think you want. And then you reflect what you think I want. And that's more likely to be what happens in a very Neptunian relationship, or relationships that start under a Neptune transit. It's a portrayal by one or both parties of what one believes the other wants and needs, so that it can be a true love fantasy that never ever dissolves.
Yeah,
And
people give up
it's
their
true
identities.
that people can absolutely always be in love with that fantasy, never necessarily recognize that there wasn't anything there beyond the fantasy. That's very disillusioning and very painful when it happens.
Yeah, I mean, I just think consciousness in general, it's I'm just going to default to most of us or we have our work cut out for us. I don't want to make the assumption that we're, so enlightened that we can be above Neptune.
Right.
I would like to think that, I can operate with a lot of faith under a Neptune transit, because that's the antidote. That's the remedy. But we'll see in 10 years when Neptune starts hitting all those points in my chart what that looks like.
And because Neptune is in every chart, every individual does have this sense of tremendous sensitivity that makes us vulnerable to individual suffering, vulnerable to the suffering of the collective, deeply compassionate, having a capacity for empathy, wanting things to get better, but also wanting to escape from the suffering that is here on the material plane. And we can do that through illusions, or we can do that through some kind of productivity. And in the future, we might be looking at the chart of a prominent politician who was born under the Saturn-Neptune conjunction of the late 80s and early 90s, which is bound to be a very interesting discussion, because to me, it's an absolutely fascinating chart. I'm even talking with my hands about it.
Just David. That's what made me think of that. Like who was on Just Jack. That's what that was. Yeah, well, then if we're concluding, then I've concluded. I think that was fun looking at his chart and kind of dissecting a little bit. Talking about events too.
Well, I liked it, and I think we're complete, and hopefully the listening audience has some material to chew on. Please, if you have an astrological topic that you'd like discussed or addressed, leave us a comment on this video. Feel free to email us at info@understandyou.com. That's info@understand-u.com. And we will integrate your interests and concerns into our conversations as much as possible. We really like listener involvement, so don't be shy.
Yes.
And
if you want a reading from either one of us, don't hesitate to message us too. So
yeah, we're both available for private consultations. Paige offers coaching services. I offer astrological readings and tutoring as well. And you can also inquire for more detail at info@understandyou.com. So with that, I think we are complete, and I'm ready to say goodnight to the listening audience and a good night to you, Paige.
Alrighty. Well, I'll see you guys next time.
Good night to you all.
Bye.